Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's our Sunday podcast, Together We Rise, featuring Indigenous women of influence. I'm really excited to have my friend Nalaga Avis O'Brien on with me today. She has an exceptional story of strength and resilience, and something that I'm sure that is going to move all of you who are listening today. So just to give a brief bio of Avis, and she's going to give her cultural welcome after I'm finished with her bio. Nalaga Avis O'Brien is Haida and Kwakwaka'wakw artist and land-based cultural empowerment facilitator born in Alert Bay. Nalaga offers community land-based healing workshops that are rooted in decolonization and reconciliation. Her workshops offer the opportunity to utilize their breath, the land, culture, and states of embodiment to heal from the attempted and ongoing impacts of colonial genocide. Drumming, singing, dancing, medicine harvesting, ceremony, weaving, breathing, and embodiment practices are all utilized as self-regulation tools, guiding folks down the path of narrow decolonization. Her work within non-Indigenous communities has a focus on building allyship and dismantling racist stereotypes against Indigenous folks through her business, Nalaga Consulting. Welcome, Nalaga. You can give your cultural
Awesome. Hawa, Erin. Yo, Galakasla, Daukwala, Nugwa Nalaga, Gayuklin la Kwakwaka'wakw get Ligwithdow, Kaukuna Hinu Di Kyan. I just wanted to first acknowledge the deep gratitude I have to be an uninvited guest and visitor here in the beautiful territory of the Comox people. The Comox Nation has 4 tribes: Comox, Pentlach, Aixin, and Satlut. So I just want to acknowledge the deep gratitude I have to be a visitor here in this beautiful territory, to be able to live and work and raise my kids here. So I wanted to open up with a song. And the song I'm going to share is a song that was composed by Gigigame Wahwidi. I can't get his pronunciation of his name right. Wahwidi. William Wasden Jr. is a hereditary chief within the Numgis First Nation, one of the 18 tribes of the Kwakwaka'wakw. And he composed this song for the Ligwithdow people. And that's the nation that I come from. And Ligwithdow in English translates to unkillable worm. So it's a serpent that lives in the ocean. And when you cut it in half, it doesn't die, but it multiplies. And it continues multiplying. And so this song, it's a song that he composed for our nation, and it's a celebration song. And I wanted to open with this because we're in the time, the world that we're in right now. It feels, there's a lot of darkness and heaviness. And I just wanted to honor Erin for having this conversation. So celebrating Erin and all the work that you're doing, and celebrating Indigenous people for being alive today, for just celebrating us as a people and what we've been through and our strength. So the invitation, while I share the song, is to get comfortable in your seat, whatever that feels like for you today. And just to be curious if you feel anything happening on the inside of your body. So maybe you feel something in your heart center, your heart chakra. Maybe you feel something in your belly. Maybe it's heat, maybe it's movement. And maybe you feel nothing at all, and that's totally okay too. The invitation is just to be curious if you sense anything happening on the inside of your body. And your eyes can be open or your eyes can be closed. Yana ho, yana ho, yana ho, hey, yeah, yeah. Yana ho,
That was beautiful.
Gala, Kesla, and Hawa for letting me open in that way, and just wanted to give a little bit of sort of a explanation for why I open in that way. So I'm going to be talking today about some of my struggles that I've overcome and continue to work on, and one being trauma.
Mhm.
And one of the impacts of trauma is dissociation or disconnection from the body. And I was one of those people who like literally just cut off from my body and lived entirely in my mind because my body wasn't a safe place. And so that's a really common thing for trauma survivors is it's so the ability to sense and feel what's happening on the inside of our bodies and be connected to our bodies is called interoception. And it's one of the things that gets impacted. And I was one of those people.
Mhm.
So our culture is one of the ways that I've found healing. And so I just wanted to open that way and invite folks to sort of be curious when you are engaging in cultural practices, just to sort of practice interoception. Do you feel anything happening?
Mhm.
And the more we do that, it's just like any skill. The more we do that, the easier it becomes.
Yeah, I know this is something that we've discussed before too about how drumming and singing we don't know exactly all of the different mechanisms that it does to your nervous system and your whole like your energetic field and everything, but I've you always want to go into it in a good place, but even if you are by yourself and you drum by yourself when you're not in a good place, it really does shift your energy and your mood, and it's like one of those magical things that happens that it really does transform this sort of negative or angst or any sort of like not pleasant feeling that's going on in the body. And it's just really interesting that, there's certain things that we do know how it works. And then there's other parts that it's just sort of on a different realm that we don't really understand. One of the things that I ask each of my guests is to discuss some of your greatest challenges or like rock bottom moments. And the reason why I ask this question is so that you can talk about what the things are that you utilized in your life to get out of those struggles or overcome those challenges. And I think it's really your story is especially powerful. And so if you want, don't speak about anything you're not uncomfortable talking about, but as much as you want to share, start with the struggles that you've had.
Somehow, yeah. So I think probably the biggest struggle, I continue, I think, as I mentioned, healing from trauma recovery for me is, I like kind of like a lifelong journey. But one of the things that really impacted my life was I was in addiction for a period of time. And so I really look at substance use and people who are using substances, not that we have a disease, but that we are doing the best we can with the tools that we have to, and the underlying root of substance use is trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I was sort of as a teenager, like a walking embodiment of the impacts of residential schools and colonization, sort of on a cellular level. So, one of the biggest things that, if we talk about colonial genocide, we use that sort of umbrella term, that systemic separation from our identities, from our language, from our clan, namimas or our clans. Our families were literally torn apart, disconnected from the land. So I was living with all of those things, which are hugely impactful and trauma in itself. But one of the biggest things that really changed the trajectory of my life was being sexually abused as a little girl. And so that trauma, and I've worked in a lot of not-for-profits, and I work with the most marginalized, most oppressed sort of folks in Indigenous communities. I think because I was there. And one of the things, I've heard probation officers say, "Oh yeah, this Indigenous youth was sexually assaulted but it was just that one time in this one foster home." And I just like that one time will entirely change the trajectory of a child's life. It changes the way that you feel safe in your own body, how you feel
Mhm.
safe in relationship to other people. So for me, that trauma, which is a direct result of residential schools, St. Mike's, to
Mhm.
be exact, that trauma and that trauma is a real epidemic in our communities. The amount of,
Absolutely.
like, if you're an Indigenous person and you weren't sexually abused, like
It's rare.
you're really
Extremely rare.
you're really privileged, especially in communities where there were residential schools.
Yeah.
Um, so for me, that trauma really changed the trajectory of my life. And so we can talk about it in terms of, like, I've started to talk about it in terms of nervous system regulation. So,
Mhm.
that trauma as a little child, that's where that dissociation or that numbing out or cutting off from my body and just living in my head, because that's a very adaptive survival strategy. If
Mhm.
for trauma survivors or folks who experience that type of abuse, in order to survive those experiences, you literally have to cut off from your body in order to survive.
Mhm.
And so that's where that sort of dissociative tendency came from being a little person. So sort of fast forward to my teenage years, once I found substances, that became my main way of regulating my nervous system. So we live with this trauma,
Mhm.
and we find ways to cope with the pain, regulate our, it's really a nervous system regulator, though, is sort of the way that I talk about it now. And so substances became the sort of my go-to for regulating my nervous system and coping with this pain that I was living with. And so fast forward to, the age of 21, I was homeless and in the downtown east side, and I was addicted to heroin, an IV heroin user. And so by the age of 21, that's what my life looked like. And
Mhm.
the downtown east side is really where our people go to live out the impacts of the colonial genocide that's been inflicted or enforced upon our people.
Absolutely.
And so I, as a teenager, I that was sort of that was my life,
Mhm.
and that's so really important to sort of acknowledge where that stems from. And then while I was down there, there was something that sort of came, an experience that I had that it was like an outside force, a spiritual something outside of me. It felt like it entered my body, and it helped me to see there has to be more for my life than this suffering, this existence. There has to be more for me to be
Mhm.
doing in the world than this. And whatever that energy was, I feel like I have a relationship with that now, and have a understanding of what that was. That, like, ancestral spirit guides was helped me to see that, and it helped me to get out of that alley. And I went and lived with my mom, and I got on the methadone maintenance program, which is like basically opioid replacement
Mhm.
therapy. And that really helped me to get sort of out of that lifestyle. And it helped me to get into treatment. And then I spent like 18 months in residential treatment. And I was just, that's all I did was like learn how to live without the use of substances, because my entire life had just been dissociative sort of disorders, and finding ways to cope and to regulate my nervous system. I didn't know how to
Mhm.
live without substances. 6 months into my recovery, I got off of methadone, and it was really hard. Actually, my doctor was like, no, 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 you got to stay on. You should just stay on methadone, because you're going to relapse and you're going to go back to the street and you're going to go back to that lifestyle. And I knew, like, I didn't want that ball and chain. I don't want it. And so but I had to fight the doctor. He was like, he wanted, I think because they make money off of it.
Oh,
I think that's the only thing I could, every time you write a prescription,
yeah. I have many thoughts around this too, because my biological father was also a heroin addict, and he lived out the last 20 years of his life on the methadone program, which was designed to get people off. It wasn't designed for people to stay on it and live on it, because it is very damaging to all of the organs in your body, right? So his body ended up just breaking down, and he died fairly young. I think he was 53. I don't know. I didn't have a relationship with him because in order to keep my life sane and safe, I, did not have a relationship with him. But yeah, it brings up a lot about how, I don't know, there's a struggle when you have the medical community saying this is okay for you to stay on it because the alternative is worse. But, if you did relapse, you could also just go back on the methadone and not, go back to the streets per se, right? So for the encouraging of you to stay on it is also sort of nonsensical. If you feel you have the strength in you to try being off of it, then yeah, I would agree with you to try it.
Well, it just makes me think of all those folks who maybe don't have that same like conviction, because I knew I don't want this ball and chain. I don't like the way it makes me feel. I want to be present and in my body and experience life. And but yeah, so I think that was a big accomplishment, getting off of methadone, because I really did have to fight. I really did have to fight for it with that doctor. And so
the first step was the treatment center.
Yeah.
And then you lived there for how long?
So I went to a residential treatment center. It's now called Heartwood. At the time, it's at the BC Women's Hospital. It was 15 years ago, so a long time ago. When I went there, it was called Aurora. And at that time, there wasn't a lot of treatment facilities that were allowing opioid replacement therapy. So I was really lucky. Yeah. Yeah.
We're behind the times in terms of treatment. It drives me insane.
And then, so that was 6 weeks. And then the remainder of the other sort of 18 months that I was like, I guess you could call it institutionalized. I was in support recovery houses. So first, second, and third stage. The third stage, there's no staff living there. You're just living there with a group of women. You all had to be working or going to school. And but yeah, that 18 months was super crucial for me, because I really didn't have any tools or any skills for like
coping in real life. And
yeah.
So were you able to work while you were in the final stages of that? And
yeah, my first job was at London Drugs. I was a cashier, and I was like, I was really proud of myself for that, because coming from the street and like having nothing, it was that job gave me a lot of sense of autonomy and agency. And so yeah, that was my first job. And then the 12-step programs, I don't really want to talk a lot about that, but that was sort of like all I did in terms of recovery and healing for like the first 4 years. The nice thing about 12-step programs is that you're with a group, like a community of people. And then sort of as I got further into my recovery, I guess at 2 years clean, I was still living with the impacts of Canada's colonial genocide, in the sense that I wasn't connected to my identity. I didn't have any desire to be connected to my identity. I still had a lot of internalized shame that was put on our people in the residential school system and through those policies that the government created to basically like turn us into non-Indigenous people. I really internalized that shame, and I didn't want any part of my culture. So my sister Megan, she had brought weaving back into our family, and so I sort of watched her from a distance, and I didn't understand it. It didn't make sense to me, and I was a little like uncomfortable with it, because I still wasn't connected to my own identity. And what shifted for me was going to Langara and meeting, women like Elisa and Genoa. And there's like these sort of group of women that I met in post-secondary school. And it was the importance of visibility, because when I thought about Indigenous people, all I thought about was the negative stereotypes.
Yeah.
So when I met these beautiful Indigenous women in school doing amazing things with their life, I was like, oh, this is something beautiful and powerful that is inside of me that I need to connect with. And so that is what that's where the shift came in, was like meeting those women.
This is why when we talk about representation and how that matters so much, because we do not have enough of those positive Indigenous role models that younger people can look to and say, wow, look at this person did this. And in fact, we have the opposite. Whenever somebody does become successful in Indigenous communities, they're like torn down by people, right? Like they're like, there's negative talk about them and things like that. And it's like, we need more positive success stories so that we can turn this. It's been ingrained in generations of our people to be ashamed of who we are. I mean, it's legitimately, it was part of the assimilation and colonization plan was to have this be embedded in us. So
Totally.
yeah, it's a powerful thing. So you were at college at Langara College, and
Yeah.
then
So I get the
connecting
visits.
with other Indigenous women.
Yeah, and that's what changed the narrative. I was like, oh, there are all these stereotypes that our society's bombarded with. Like, I started that my narrative started to change, and it became something that I was open to connecting with. And so then, when me and my sister were visiting my mom for Christmas, and she had cedar and she was weaving, I was then open to that. Sorry, I was then
And
open
at what point did you realize how healing being a part of the culture was? Like, when did that realization happen?
Yeah, so when I touched cedar for the first time, it wasn't like, oh, I'm not ashamed anymore. But because cedar is our most powerful medicine, and it has the ability to absorb our energy, emotional, spiritual, mental energy, that was the beginning of my journey of that shame being taken, and me starting to like unpack and let go of all of that shame that I had carried, but also that my ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was sort of the beginning of my journey to where I am now. And in terms of healing, like my worldview has really shifted away from like, the disease model. Like I don't believe people use substances because they have the disease of alcoholism. That just isn't my truth.
Mm-hmm.
That isn't, I believe that people use substances because they have unhealed trauma and they're doing the best that they can to cope. So then the further I got connected to my identity, but I was living in Vancouver at the time and I didn't have access to Kwakwaka'wakw or Haida culture. And so I was brought into prairie culture. So I started going to sun dances and sweat lodges, and and I'm so grateful for people welcoming me into those communities, because those ceremonies have literally saved my life over the past 15 years or 10 years that I've been connecting to them. Because trauma, it's not cognitive. It lives in our bodies and it lives in our nervous system. Our bodies and our minds are connected, they're one. So there is the cognitive element to trauma, but trauma really is like embedded in the cells in our bodies, and it lives in our nervous system, especially for Indigenous people, because we have, like, for myself, for example, I have the trauma that I experienced as a person, but also we live with intergenerational and historical trauma that gets passed down through the genetics. So ceremony, I could sit in front of a therapist for the next 30 years and not get anywhere near the amount of healing, somatic healing, that can happen when we're engaged in our Indigenous contemplative practices. And the work of Dr. Michael Yellowbird, he talks about neurodecolonization. So what happens in our brains and in our bodies when we're engaged in our contemplative practices? So when we're sitting in ceremony, when we're sitting in prayer, when we're singing, when we're dancing, what is actually going on, and why are these things so healing for us? Because these are the things that have literally kept me alive today. And it will forever be grateful for the 12-step programs, because they're there for people when they first get off the street, and we need those programs. But as I got into my recovery, I found that I needed more of that somatic healing, because my trauma was really living in my body.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've had the experience of having like healing ancestral pain in those ceremonies as well, like crying tears that weren't my own, that it was pain that my ancestors had carried and never got the privilege to.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Western culture thinks of healing as an individual thing, and Indigenous cultures recognize that it is very intergenerational and that we carry a lot, and that we don't believe in time as being a linear thing, like there's different, time things happening all at once. So when we heal ourselves, we're healing the previous generations and we're healing the next generations. And I think that's something that anytime I've done any kind of ceremony, I've definitely been cognizant of the fact that most of what I'm processing has been just like come through me from previous generations' trauma.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you about some of the favorite things that you go to. Like, what are your go-to things that help you stay healthy and in balance now? Because I know that every day is a struggle. Like, it's not as though you reach recovery and now everything's just rosy. You still have challenges. You still have, stressful times. Parenting in and of itself is like a whole triggering event. And so what sorts of things are your go-tos that help you stay in balance?
Definitely like cultural practices, all those, those like our drumming and singing. I've been learning about the vagus nerve. I'm not sure if you've learned a little bit.
Oh yeah, because fibromyalgia, we have
Right.
the same issue with the fibromyalgia. So it's definitely triggering on the vagus nerve for
Yeah.
sure.
So the more I learn about the nervous system and how trauma sort of lives in the nervous system, and how stimulating or activating the vagus nerve can move us more into the state where we want to be. So like our nervous system is like an upside down triangle at the base of our brain stem, and where we want to be is like at the top. And when we're at the top, we have access to our prefrontal cortex, which is where our best thinking, our rational thinking, lit mind lives. But when people are in a constant state of fight or flight, or they're in that collapsed immobility, they're dissociated, they literally don't have access to their best thinking. So people get stuck. So the more I've learned about how important it is to access the vagus nerve, which singing does. And that's why I always say, like when I'm teaching culture in the programs that I develop or that I deliver, singing is foundational in all of it. There's drumming and singing and everything. And I always say, like, we don't sing there's so many benefits to singing other than sounding good. Because I think a lot of youth especially don't want to sing because they're insecure about their voice. And so like we sing because our ancestors were literally imprisoned for it. And then it's also really good for the vagus nerve and helps us move into that more regulated
Yeah.
state. So
even humming. So even if you don't want to sing, just humming.
yeah.
If youth don't want to sing, even if they hum along, humming has the same effect because it's triggering of that vagus nerve in a healthy way.
Vibrates the larynx. And then also drumming and singing is really good for trauma recovery because it's bilateral stimulation. So we have to use both sides of the brain at the same time. And it's incredibly healing for trauma recovery. So drumming and singing is like definitely one of my go-tos. Smudging and praying and cold water. Cold water is also incredibly important for the vagus nerve.
I just started employing the cold showers. I guess it was during COVID lockdown. My son had been for 2 years trying to convince me to do the cold showers. And he's like, there's all these health benefits. Like, just try it. Cause I'm such a wuss. And then I started thinking, like, my ancestors would be so embarrassed of what a wuss I am. Like, I'm like, ooh, I'm cold, So I started doing that. And I didn't really realize how many health benefits there were, but I started doing it because of the vagal stimulation. So stimulating the vagus nerve it totally helps with my fibromyalgia. So whenever it gets really bad, that's what I do.
It's interesting too, because like for my fibromyalgia, cold it's like hurts my body when I'm cold. But there's something about it. It's pretty magical.
Yeah, totally. But I think about our ancestors, like I remember reading the account of this missionary who was in Haida Gwaii and saying, I don't know why the women and children go out and bathe in the ocean no matter how cold it is. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I can't imagine. I'm such a wuss. But yeah, it really does help. It has therapeutic benefits. Not to mention all the minerals that you're absorbing through your skin when you're in the ocean.
Yeah.
But anyway, so we also have another thing in common, and that is working within the nonprofit realm, because most of the work that I did for the first part of my life was working in working with an Indigenous youth empowerment program. And I developed programs and facilitated programs and like had a lot of challenges, and not with the kids. That was absolutely the most amazing work. I loved working with the kids, but working within nonprofit organizations can be really challenging. Do you want to talk about some of the challenges that you faced working in nonprofits?
Totally. It's definitely one of the reasons why I work for myself now and have a business and can sort of have my own autonomy for the kind of work that I do, because I really struggled working within nonprofits. And I guess I just want to start by saying, like, I'm incredibly grateful for not for profits, because they, they save lives, and they provide, treatment and access to programs that are crucial to people who are suffering.
Mhm.
But for myself, I definitely struggled in terms of, the kind of work that, I believe that, like, Indigenous knowledge is really sacred, and it's really special, and it's powerful. And one of the things that I really struggled with was getting paid, getting paid $20 an hour to translate knowledge that has endured 500 years of attempted and ongoing colonial genocide. Like, what has that knowledge actually had to survive in order to get here? So I really struggled, I guess, with the financial component of that. And then also just like all the bureaucratic sort of red tape, blocking really important, really good work because of like
Mhm.
bureaucratic things that, like, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, I feel like I had a lot of really good ideas and wanted to do a lot of really great work, but it was kind of squashed,
Yeah.
for reasons that I don't really know. So now working for myself, funding is always an issue, because I
Mhm.
have a business, but programs need to be funded. But having the autonomy and not having that bureaucratic, like, sort of oppressive colonial structure
Yeah.
down, sort of weighing you down. Yeah.
Well, that was one of the reasons why I asked you to be on the board of directors for Copper Legacy, because it's something that we both recognize is how colonized nonprofits are. Even with the whole board structure and the Society Act and all of those things, it's so hierarchical, and it's so, like you said, red tape. And it doesn't value the knowledge that Indigenous people, like you said, our generations have had this knowledge, but it took you so much time and so much dedication to learn and to like reabsorb that part of your being in order to share it with people, and to have that be undervalued when it is literally like there isn't a ton of people that you can go and hire to be a cultural leader in any of your programs. So if you're not, compensating them fairly, or you're not allowing them to do what the culture would require them to do in order to work effectively with their own people, like that sort of thing is just, it's so frustrating.
Well, and then, like, because I don't have a university education, that's all that, well, you don't have a degree, so that was always a thing. But like, the knowledge that I carry can't be attained through Western education.
No.
It was attained through the last decade of spending time with elders and time on the land, and being in my culture, which it's not a Western institution. You have to spend
Mhm.
the time with the knowledge keepers in order to obtain that information and that knowledge. Um, so yeah, but it's a struggle working with, underneath that sort of colonial bureaucratic.
Mhm.
I'm so grateful for Copper Legacy and for Indigenous run, um,
Yeah.
programs. And I guess my struggle right now is programs still not offering. There's so many programs that are still not, youth programs that are not offering, in-person work. And for
Yes.
me, like, we've lost 4 youth in in Kwakwaka'wakw territory to suicide in the last 4
Mhm.
months, and that's only the people that I know. There's maybe more.
Yeah,
But,
so that's what I was going to segue into, your what inspired you to develop the youth suicide prevention program.
so Inteloquimos is a, Kwakwaka'wakw youth suicide prevention initiative, and what inspired me was, the there was a young woman by the name of Tamika Mountain, and she unfortunately died by suicide in the springtime. And I didn't actually know Tamika. I never met her, but her passing, I guess, sort of awoke something in me, that I was just tired and done. I guess living in isolation with my own struggle, with the spirit of suicide, because it's something that I've lived with since I was 10 years old. I have a relationship with it now. I have tools. I know how to work through all of those things. But very much was sort of, that was very much personal work, and something I wasn't vocal or public about in any way. Her passing propelled me to be done with living in isolation with that, and wanting to take the knowledge that I've acquired over the past decade in terms of healing and wellness and translate that into a suicide prevention initiative for youth. And I guess another inspiration or motivating piece to that was I had just finished a Kwakwaka'wakw Women's Yoga Initiative that was hosted by Yoga Outreach and Jessica Barudin. And so the framework of the program is, it's not identical, but a lot of the themes are very similar. So in Inteloquimos, it's a 10-week cohort, and it's a combination of land-based healing Indigenous land-based healing modalities, trauma-informed yoga, suicide prevention from a social justice lens. So we look at suicidality not as there's a problem within the individual, but suicidality as actually a normal response to living with the burdens of 500 years of attempted and ongoing colonial genocide. And it's really, suicidality is more of a reflection of the brokenness of these invisible sort of systems of oppression that drive the world that we live in. So it's really looking at it more of like a societal problem rather than there's something wrong, taking the pathology out of the person. And so we're, drumming and singing, and those are tools. Like we're going to be delivering those as these are self-regulation tools. So, kids who are self-harming or feeling suicidal, they, especially self-harm, like that's a form of nervous system regulation. So how can we give kids other ways of regulating their nervous system that don't harm them?
Yeah.
And so drumming and singing and dancing and weaving and cold water cleansing and cedar brushing, those are ways that we can regulate our nervous system that not only do they not harm us, but they actually like move us sort of more into that nervous system state that we want to be in, where we can access like our best thinking and we can be engaged in the world instead of always in fight or flight or sort of collapsed immobility. So yeah, Tamika Mountain was the inspiration behind the program.
One thing that I think would be interesting to add to the program, and I don't know how it would fit in, but because I'm obsessed with nutritional wellness and knowing how much all of those neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and those things are, mostly serotonin is actually created in our gut. And so it's really almost impossible to feel good if you don't have good gut health. And so teaching youth, like it's one of the things that I did when I worked at the nonprofit that I worked for was teaching nutrition. And just based on the wellness aspect of it, I mean, Indigenous people's diets today are so far removed from what our traditional diets were, filled with, omega-3s from the fish, and that's brain food, and it's, just fully healthy food. But just like helping to shift back to like away from the processed foods and towards more of the natural salmon and the natural foods that are grown from the earth and not from factories. I mean, that would be a powerful component to add to it too, because sometimes it's not just all those things that you listed. Sometimes this physical healing can take place and it can really help the overall mental health.
Totally. Yeah. And the gut is so connected to the vagus nerve as well.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's intrinsically connected.
Yeah. It's like anytime you feel any sort of nervousness or anxiety, like you feel it in your gut, and it's like your gut has its own brain. I think there's like just as many neurotransmitters in your gut as there is in your brain. I think I could be wrong, but there's something correlated like that. In any case, that might be a cool thing to add to the development of the program.
Totally.
So I think our people need a lot of help when it comes to making the right. Yeah, I'm like, do you eat healthy? Oh yeah, I eat healthy. It's like everyone thinks they eat healthy until you actually look at what a healthy diet is, and then you're like, maybe not so much. Yeah. In any case, I think that was an awesome session, and I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add, but that was all the questions I had for you. If you have anything that you want to add at the end here, how people can get a hold of you if they're interested in workshops and.
Yeah, I guess through Instagram. My Instagram account is Nalaga Consulting, or my website. Yeah, and I just want to express my gratitude to you, Erin, for holding space for this conversation. And yeah, I think my experience sort of in the world, I guess the work that I do too, really, I'm working with the most oppressed and marginalized group of folks, and really living with a lot of suffering. And so I feel like my voice really reflects a lot, like a pretty common experience for our people. So I really appreciate you holding space for this conversation. And yeah, some of the things I talked about weren't necessarily easy to yeah, hold space for, to be in conversation about, but I just really want to express my gratitude to you for that. And yeah, if there's any young people listening, I guess the one message I would love to share with the young people in our nation is just that that you belong. And this creating a culture of belonging is one of the things that I've been working towards. And we were systemically separated on every level. The government systemically disconnected us from everything that meant anything to us. So I just will want the young people to know that they belong. You belong to the land and to the Creator and to your Namima, and you have a place within our culture and in our community. And I really hope to see I'm really happy to see our cultural practices. The big house opening. With the vaccine passport, you're able to engage in our culture again, because I really believe that culture saves lives.
Absolutely.
I'm really happy to see things moving in that direction.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Thanks for joining me today.
Gaelic